tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Hello, everyone. Think about it for a moment. What would happen if the largest aircraft and automotive industries in the US were on the brink of collapse? Tariffs that could change everything. Imagine that these are not just threats, they are a real threat of supply chain disruption and catastrophic economic consequences for entire countries. The US has decided to impose a 10% tariff on aircraft and components, and this is just the beginning. But what is behind these decisions? What are the consequences for the whole world?
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Canada and Mexico are already preparing a counterattack, and major airlines such as Boeing and Airbus are sounding the alarm. Production facilities could come to a halt. Millions of people around the world will feel the impact of higher airfares, and factories that have provided stability for decades could be shut down. The North American economy will be threatened, and global markets will face unpredictable consequences. The aircraft industry, once a symbol of progress, is now on the brink of collapse.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
But what do the biggest players in the aviation industry think about this? What measures are companies and unions taking? And how will Mexico and Canada respond if their economies come under attack? What will happen to ticket prices, jobs, and global cooperation in this industry? In the coming weeks, the fate of global aviation will be decided in courts and diplomatic negotiations.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
Today, we will tell you how the tariff war could lead to a real economic storm that will affect every passenger, every employee, and every airline. Who will emerge victorious, and who will suffer the heaviest losses? The threat of the destruction of the entire aircraft manufacturing industry is no longer just words, but a reality that the world will face in the near future. Stay with us and find out what lies ahead for the global economy.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
In recent years, the US aviation and automotive industries have experienced a real boom. Technology has improved, production capacity has grown, and the market has been stable. However, a new player has appeared on the horizon: tariff policy, which, according to experts, could completely change the picture. When the US administration announced the introduction of tariffs on imported cars and aircraft components, it caused an uproar among economists, politicians, and industry representatives. And these are not just tax changes, they are a potential threat to thousands of jobs and global supply chains.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Ontario and Quebec, two Canadian regions that traditionally supply components for the US automotive and aviation industries, have found themselves at the forefront of this economic conflict. Nearly 30% of all automotive products manufactured in the Canadian province are exported to the US, and now, with the increase in tariffs, many local companies are facing the possibility of layoffs and bankruptcy. Spare parts that were supplied in huge volumes may now become unavailable due to new trade barriers, resulting in huge losses for both manufacturers and end consumers. Quebec, for example, is home to the largest aircraft parts manufacturing plant, which produces components for giants such as Boeing and Airbus. With the increase in duties and the threat of further rate hikes, many analysts fear that these plants may cease operations leading to mass layoffs and a decline in living standards.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
The aviation industry, which has long been one of the pillars of the global economy, has also found itself in a difficult position. From the very first day the tariffs were introduced, companies such as Boeing warned of the risks to their production lines and, more importantly, to entire industries that depend on uninterrupted supplies. The US tariffs have affected both commercial and military aircraft. For example, Mexico, a major manufacturer of aircraft engines for US companies, has already said it will have to raise prices for its components if the tariffs remain in place. This poses a threat to the entire global market. Ticket prices could rise sharply and the production of new aircraft could be jeopardized. It is possible that giants such as Boeing will be forced to halt production, which would deal a devastating blow to the economy and jobs.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
The next step prepared by the US is to increase tariffs to 25% and possibly even higher. This threat has caused even greater concern in the international community, especially in Canada and Mexico. A sudden increase in tariffs will not only lead to higher prices for cars and aircraft components, but also destroy the economies of countries that depend on these supplies. In the first days after the introduction of the new duties, economists predicted that the consequences of this move could be global and devastating. In particular, the global supply chain on which businesses and countries depend could be threatened. Experts warn that if tariffs continue to rise, even giants such as General Motors and Ford will be forced to reconsider their plans for production and the launch of new models. Moreover, higher tariffs could reduce the competitiveness of US manufacturers in the global market, as other countries will look for cheaper alternatives in other regions.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
But the consequences of these steps will not only affect businesses. Many small and medium-sized businesses that depended on supplies of spare parts and components will be threatened with closure. Layoffs, falling purchasing power, and rising unemployment could all be part of this economic storm. For example, a company that manufactures parts for the automotive industry in Canada has said that if tariffs remain at current levels, it will be forced to cut up to 20% of its workforce, threatening the stability of entire families. And this is just the beginning. This move by the US gives the impression that the country has decided to put its economy on the line. In fact, these tariffs could affect the global economy much more than it seems at first glance. The America First policy could have devastating consequences for entire sectors that were previously considered unshakable. According to analysts, this move is an attempt by the US to regain control over certain markets, but the consequences could be too great. The aviation market, like the automotive industry, is going through difficult times, and with the introduction of these duties, the future of these industries remains highly uncertain.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
When the US began imposing tariffs, it initially appeared to be simply a move to strengthen its economy. However, with each passing day, the situation became increasingly tense, and the world began to realize the scale of the impending consequences. In the first few weeks, the international community began to protest. Canadian and Mexican representatives openly opposed the new tariffs, and not just as political statements, these steps began to have real economic consequences. Canadian company Bombardier, which supplies aircraft components and systems for various aircraft models, warned that the tariff increase would jeopardize its ability to fulfill contracts with American partners. This means not only a slowdown in production, but also job cuts in Canada. The same problems began to accumulate in Mexico, where companies producing aircraft parts announced possible cuts at their plants. In both countries, economies dependent on trade with the US began to show the first signs of crisis. 6 countries, including Canada and Mexico, lodged protests with the US. These countries argued that the tariffs imposed on national security grounds had no objective basis and only undermined international trade agreements such as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. However, the US government stuck to its position, arguing that these measures were necessary to protect its own producers and ensure security in the high-tech goods market. In response, the international community began to prepare not only economic but also legal countermeasures. It was expected that Canada and Mexico would be supported by other major players on the world stage, including the European Union and China, which had already expressed concern about the increase in duties. The tariffs caused significant problems in the global supply chain, and this effect was felt at every stage of production. Aircraft manufacturers, including the American Boeing and the European Airbus, began to warn of threats to their supplies, especially with regard to parts they receive from manufacturers in Canada and Mexico. These parts and components are a critical part of the aircraft manufacturing process, and any disruption in their delivery immediately leads to a slowdown in production, which can result in significant financial losses. As early as the beginning of July, experts predicted that delivery delays could affect the release dates of new aircraft models, as well as ticket prices for passengers who are likely to face price increases. Paradoxical as it may seem, it is precisely these increased duties on aircraft components that could lead to higher airfares worldwide. Analysts have predicted that if no compromise solution is found, ticket prices could rise by 10 to 15% over the next year. Airlines around the world have already begun to prepare for this, with giants such as American Airlines and Delta announcing their intention to review their fares. But more importantly, some smaller carriers have begun to fear that the increase in the cost of aircraft components will make it impossible for them to remain competitive in the market. By this time, there were already signs that the problem with tariffs on aircraft and car components would not be limited to economic consequences for manufacturers and consumers. Some public and private companies began preparing for legal action against the US. Mexico announced its intention to file a complaint with the World Trade Organization, WTO, arguing that the US actions violate international trade, agree as illegal under global economic norms. Canadian officials, in turn, insisted that raising tariffs on components they supply to the US is an unfair and illegal move. Meanwhile, unions representing workers in the US auto and aviation industries began to support the tariff policy, arguing that it would protect jobs and ensure the competitiveness of American product. These statements sparked heated debate in political circles, where many saw the tariffs not only as an economic necessity but also as a political maneuver aimed at strengthening the US position in the global market. However, Such actions caused concern among large corporations that supply parts and components to American manufacturers. Companies such as General Motors and Ford warned that the tariff increase would lead to significant losses in production capacity and, as a result, higher car prices, which would make it difficult for them to compete in the market. Given these threats, Canada and Mexico, as well as other major manufacturers, will have to take retaliatory measures. At the same time, in response to the US actions, both countries began to develop their own tariffs on American goods. Experts predict that this could lead to a trade war that would affect not only the aviation and automotive industries, but also other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture and energy. According to analysts, concrete proposals to impose duties on various goods, including American aircraft, will be on the table as early as July, which in turn will create additional problems for aircraft manufacturing. One of the most difficult aspects of this conflict is that the situation is deteriorating with each passing day, and there are fewer and fewer options for compromise between the countries. Legal and political proceedings are dragging on, and the real impact of these tariffs on the economy is becoming increasingly apparent. With each step, the US and its neighbors are moving further away from a peaceful resolution to this crisis, and the world is waiting to see what consequences this will bring in the future. The global aviation and automotive industries are at the center of a global economic storm, and with each passing day, the consequences of the new tariffs are becoming more devastating. In response to the US actions, Canada and Mexico are beginning to prepare countermeasures, heralding the start of a full-blown trade war that will affect millions of people around the world. Each country is now preparing to respond to the threat with tariffs that they believe jeopardize not only economic stability, but also the security of entire industries, including aviation. The measures taken could be much more painful than anyone anticipated. Trade unions and organizations representing workers in the aviation and automotive industries have expressed their support for the US tariffs. They argue that the introduction of duties will help preserve jobs and support American manufacturers in the face of global competition. This statement has attracted the attention of politicians who have sided with workers, assuring them that the tariff increase will not only protect local jobs, but also strengthen national security, as dependence on foreign supplies is dangerous for strategically important industries. However, not everyone believes these measures are the right ones. Many companies, such as Boeing and Airbus, have begun to sound the alarm that if the tariff policy continues, they will face unpredictable problems in the supply chain. There are already reports of serious delays in the production of new aircraft and rising prices for components, which will inevitably lead to higher airfares. Experts predict that tariffs on aircraft components and spare parts could increase ticket prices by 10 to 15%, and in some cases even more, especially if the situation does not stabilize in the coming months. This will have a significant impact on passengers and international air travel. In response, major airlines have begun to revise their plans for the future. For example, major US carriers such as Delta and American Airlines have already stated that if the tariffs continue, they will be forced to change their pricing policies and increase fares. Such changes will affect not only economy class but also business class, where the increase could be as high as 20%. In turn, international carriers such as Emirates and Air France have also begun to take measures to adapt to the new economic conditions. One of the most difficult tasks for Canada and Mexico is to take retaliatory measures. These countries are already starting to develop their own tariffs on US goods. However, this is far from an easy task, as the US is the largest trading partner for both Canada and Mexico. These countries find themselves in a difficult position, trying to find a balance between protecting their economies and maintaining their partnership with America. At the moment, it is known that Mexico has already prepared retaliatory measures, which include tariffs on American aircraft and automotive components. Canada, in turn, is considering the possibility of introducing similar measures, but with an emphasis on products supplied to the US, including high-tech products. Legal action is another aspect worth paying attention to. Canada and Mexico have already begun preparing lawsuits against the US, accusing the country of violating international trade norms and agreements such as NAFTA. If these lawsuits are successful, it could have serious consequences not only for the US economy but also for the entire global system of trade agreements. However, in response to these actions, the US claims that it is acting within the framework of international law, citing Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allows tariffs to be imposed in the interests of national security. the steps being taken to introduce new tariffs could lead to an economic crisis that will affect all countries trading with the US. In the coming weeks, countries will be forced to make decisions that will determine the future of world trade and the aviation industry. If the situation does not stabilize, it is possible that long-term trade agreements will be destroyed and global economic ties will be revised, which will be a real challenge for all countries. Canada and Mexico have already warned that if the US continues its tariff policy, they will have to take tough action. Experts predict that possible retaliatory measures by these countries could include tariffs on a wide range of American goods, including high-tech products and products that form the basis of trade between the countries. If these measures are implemented, it will not only deal a blow to the US economy, but also lead to a sharp increase in prices for products and services that are directly dependent on the stability of international supplies. Retaliatory measures could also include sanctions and legal action against the US in international courts. Mexico has already filed a lawsuit in the International Trade Court, arguing that the tariffs imposed by the US violate the rights of its citizens and international economic agreements. Such actions could trigger a chain reaction, with other countries supporting Canada and Mexico also filing lawsuits, leading to further deterioration of trade relations and instability in global markets. At that point, the global economy will find itself in a difficult position, and many industries will seek ways to maintain their positions and adapt to the new conditions. When the crisis begins, the consequences will be felt not only in the economy but also in the political arena. The tariffs imposed by the US could lead to political isolation and threatening economic consequences for America itself. Countries affected by these tariffs will struggle to restore their economies and find new trading partners, which in turn will call into question America's position on the international stage.